A number of years ago, when my kids were quite young, we took a family vacation to the beach in Florida. We'd been looking forward to this vacation for a long time. For my youngest daughter, who was 3 at the time, this was her first trip to the ocean. And so we got packed, and she was especially excited, and she packed herself, got her swimsuit, had her floaties, and we made the 10-hour drive through the night. When we arrived, it was mid-morning the next day, and we all quickly got changed, and we're heading from our condo out to the beach. My youngest daughter, again, she's 3, she had her floaties on. We're going out to the beach, but to get to the beach, with the beautiful white sands of the Gulf of Mexico, you had to pass by this kind of crummy pool that was a part of the condo we were staying in. As we were walking by the swimming pool, my 3-year-old just jumps right in. She jumps in and she's splashing and having fun, and the rest of us are like, get out of the, we didn't drive 10 hours to swim in this pool. We came for the ocean. But when she saw the pool, she was just too excited, and she wanted us to get in the pool with her, and she didn't want to go to the beach. But the problem was she just didn't understand. Like, all she could really see was what was right in front of her, and she didn't understand what was across the street. And so I'm trying to convince her, and trying to use advanced logic with the 3-year-old, get her out of the pool so we can go to the beach, and it's not working. And so finally, I just set down all the stuff I was carrying, and I scooped her up out of the water, and she's crying and yelling, and I carried her underneath my arm across the street to the beach, and she loved it. And we stayed at the beach and had fun, and she never went back to the pool. Like, she stayed at the beach and played for the rest of the week. And so I think that we all kind of have this in us, that we settle for what we can see when there's oftentimes something better right across the street. Like, we settle for what's in front of us. We settle for what's familiar. We settle for what is comfortable and predictable. And I think for a lot of us, that's what we think we want even now. We just want to go back to the pool. We just want to go back to what we know and when things were normal and predictable before there was a disruption. And first it came along in the form of a pandemic, and it yanked us out of the water, and we were kicking and screaming because we wanted to stay in the pool. But what if there's something better? I mean, maybe you can't see it from here, but what if there's something better across the street? And that's what we're talking about in this series called Never Going Back. And this week's message is never going back to settling for superficial. And specifically, I'm talking about superficial relationships. Because here's what's gonna happen, right? Like, our time demands are gonna start, in fact, many of us are already feeling it. Our time demands are gonna start to ramp back up. Our calendars are gonna start to fill up. Suddenly, our attention is gonna have all kinds of competition again. And so now's the time for us to just stop for a moment and say, I don't want to just go back to the way things were. Where every night it was a different activity, another event, a practice, a performance, and there are long hours at the office, and we were just all emotionally and physically drained, and we go home, we got nothing to give, and our spiritual lives are kind of an afterthought, and we try to make it to church on 1 or 2 weekends a month when we don't have something else going on. And we end up settling for these shallow relationships, and we put off deeper connection and difficult conversations, and we put them off sometimes a week. Sometimes we end up putting them off a generation, and we just miss out on what God really wants for us to have, the kind of authentic relationships that God created us to have, that we are to be known by God, but we're also to know and be known deeply by one another. Like, there's just so much joy and satisfaction in life when we have that. And so I think for me as a pastor, even in the midst of all of this craziness, I'm thankful. Like, I'm thankful that we get to be the church in this season of the world, because I just believe that what we have found in Jesus is what so many people are looking for. That what we have found in him, like, the pandemic comes along and it just strips away what so many people had put their hope in. But that's not us. because our hope is in Jesus, and he is the one hope that doesn't disappoint. And that means a virus may cancel everything, might cancel everything else, but it can't cancel the peace and the joy that we have in Jesus. And then, last number of weeks, the last number of generations, the world is reeling from deep pains and wounds that come from a long history of racism. But as a church, we have an opportunity to model the uniting power of the gospel, that what unites us in Christ squashes whatever else might divide us. We saw it last week from Ephesians 2, that the cross has destroyed the dividing wall of hostility that makes us one. The cross accomplishes that. The gospel does for us what no political solution could ever accomplish. We have that in Jesus. Everyone's trying to figure out, well, how can we have that kind of community? What do we do with all this division? And the cross is where we find that connection. I was at a prayer group last week with a few brothers in our church, and it's been a long time since we'd met together to pray. And as we met to pray, I just was struck by something that hadn't occurred to me until we were in the moment. And I looked around the room, and there were a few men in our church that I know were going downtown to peacefully protest that day. But there was another man in our church who was in uniform, was going downtown as well as a police officer, and I just listened to those brothers pray for each other. And I listened as the police officer prayed humbly for healing and restoration. And I listened as the protesters prayed for protection for that officer, and as they gave thanks to God for one another. The police officer gave thanks to God for the protesters' passion for our community. And as the protesters gave thanks to God for a police officer who saw his calling as sacred, that he does his job to serve the Lord first and then to love the people in his community. And as I was listening to it, it's the church. That happens in the church. We have what so many people right now are longing for. So this weekend, we're going to look at the Old Testament book of Ruth. And we're going to discover that when everything else around us is falling apart and when so much of life gets stripped away, that's when we realize how important relationships are, but not just a lot of relationships, but even more significantly, the depth of a few relationships. Like those relationships have a way of giving us purpose and identifying who we are and giving us an anchor in the storms. And like some of you know that you know it because of the last few months. You either know it and are thankful for it because you've got some people like this in your life, or you realize that this is something that's been missing. Like you really need this kind of friendship, this kind of relationship. And so what makes the book of Ruth so interesting is that we're going to read about that kind of deep relationship, that kind of friendship, but it's between two unlikely people. It's between a mother-in-law, Naomi, and her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And so here's where our story begins. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." And so what we see right out of the gate is that there is a crisis. Like things are desperate. A famine in those days was devastating. It would mean complete economic ruin for really everybody. And so that's how the story starts. The story starts with this famine. And without enough food to eat, people start to get a little bit desperate. Like starvation has a way of creating desperation. And people will do anything for food. And so that's what happens. There's this famine in the land. People are desperate for food. And so as you read in this story, we're going to find out that this specific family isn't sure where to go or what to do, but they know what's been normal isn't working anymore. And so we read about a famine. It's kind of a broad description, but we're going to read individually about this one family. We're going to zoom in the middle of this crisis to read about just one family in particular. Verse 1 says, "So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." So they hold out, this family holds out as long as they can, hoping things are going to get better. But one day, the father, Elimelech, that's his name, he said to his wife Naomi, "Baby, there's no food. There's no food." And people, you just look around, they're starving to death. And while we still have enough physical strength, we need to just take the boys and we need to leave. We got to try something different. This isn't working. Just for a while, we can come back when the famine is over. And so the family packs up and they leave. And I'm sure in this moment, Naomi wondered, will we ever come home? Will things ever go back to normal? How long is this going to last? And it probably seemed, at least I'm guessing, as she left, that things couldn't get much worse. Her family is starving. They're leaving everything they know and the people they love. It's just her and her husband and her 2 sons. It is a desperate situation. But she's about ready to find out that sometimes one difficult situation comes on the heels of another. So we read in verse 3, "Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons." So she's living in the strange land of Moab, and her husband dies. But at least she has her 2 sons. At least she has them. And then we read in verse 4, they married Moabite women, and one of her sons married Orpah, and the other married Ruth. Now you read that, and you think, well, that's good, right? Like they found wives in this strange land, but it's not good. In fact, it was a really big deal in those days for a son to marry an Israelite woman. Like it was a big deal that they're marrying women from Moab that was an enemy of Israel. And so they marry these 2 women, and I am sure that when Naomi and her husband Elimelech were talking about what do they do, and do they stay in Bethlehem or do they go to Moab, I'm sure Naomi said, look, what if we go to Moab and it's worst case scenario and our boys end up marrying Moabite women? But that is exactly what happens. Her husband dies, they marry Moabite women. It's just one difficult situation, now it's another one. And they live there for 10 years. And then we read that both of her sons died. There's a lot we don't know, but just in the first 4 verses, she's buried her 2 sons along with her husband in this foreign land. And her sons must have struggled with infertility because they were married 10 years, but they have no children. Naomi has no grandchildren. And I'm sure she just felt very disillusioned and very much alone, and she's facing a very uncertain future. And where do you go? What do you do in this situation? Well, she gets word that the famine in Bethlehem is coming to an end, and things are starting to get back to some kind of version of normal. And she decides that she's going to go back. And I'm sure she knew that things would not be the same going back. Like for her, she left with a husband and 2 sons. She's coming back, and her husband and 2 sons are buried. There's no going back to normal. Initially, we're told that her 2 daughters-in-law are going to go back with her. They're going to go back with Naomi, and they start to head back. Like they begin the journey, and then verse 11, Naomi says to her 2 daughters-in-law, she says, what are you doing? Don't come with me. Return home. Go back to Moab, my daughters. Why would you come with me? And she just tries to talk them into staying in their homeland of Moab, which I think tells you something about the relationship of these 3 ladies, that the daughters-in-law wanted to go with their mother-in-law to begin with. That seems surprising, but here's what I think happened, that those 3 ladies became deeply connected through grief and loss. That one of the ways God redeems desperate moments is he gives us an opportunity to know people and be known by people in deeper ways than we did before. I think that's what happened with Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. But she knows it's just not practical. And so she pleads with them, don't come with me. You stay here in Moab. Verse 14 says, at this, they wept aloud again, and then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. So Ruth just refuses to let go. And Naomi tries again to talk her into staying in Moab. It says, look, Naomi says, look, your sister-in-law she's going back to her people and to her gods. Go back, just go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't do this. Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So here's what happens in the story is that Ruth speaks commitment to Naomi. And Ruth says, no matter where you go, I will go. And Ruth says, no matter what, nothing but death will separate us. And I think one thing that's become clear in these past 2.5 months is how rare and precious that kind of commitment really is. That no matter where, no matter what kind of relationships. In fact, during this time, my guess is that some of you, you've realized that you've spent so much of your time up until this season putting relational energy into casual relationships. And maybe as you step back and you take a look at your life during this series of never going back, maybe you step back and you look at it and you say, if I'm honest, I don't really have anybody like that. I don't really have any no matter where, no matter what friends. And I know most of us long for that. I mean, this is what we long for, a no matter where, no matter what relationship. But here's the thing. If you want a no matter where, no matter what person in your life, then you have to be a no matter where, no matter what person to other people. If you want someone to have that kind of commitment towards you, then you need to have that kind of commitment towards someone else, where you deeply commit yourself to a few people in your life. I think before the last few months, a lot of us confused the number of connections we maintained with the depths of relationship we enjoyed. In other words, if you said, hey, do you have close friends? We would answer that question by saying, well, I got a lot of friends. Well, those are two different questions. We've confused the number of connections we've maintained, connected to a lot of people with the depth of relationships we've enjoyed. But I think one of the things that we've learned during this season, I hope we've learned during this season, is it's not the number of connections, it's the level of commitment that determines the depth of your relationships. And some of you are trying to figure out, why don't I have people like this in my life? Why don't I have these kinds of relationships and friends? Look, it's not the number of connections. It is the level of commitment that will determine the depth of relationships. And so I think that seems more clear these days than ever, that connections without commitment leaves us feeling alone. Like connections without commitment, they just don't hold up, right? Like when life gets hard, it gets exposed. So what I want to do for just a few minutes is talk about the types of commitments that move us beyond superficial relationships and get us deeper in our connection with one another. So here's one step towards deeper relationships is that you be the kind of person where you can be counted on. Like you can be counted on. You're going to do what you say. The Bible tells us that Ruth clung to Naomi. Listen to Proverbs 18, verse 24. It says, a man of many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. There's a friend that sticks closer to you when life is hard. But if you got all kinds of friends, then when you're really in need and when things get really difficult, you find that you're in trouble. And so there's something better than having a ton of casual friends, and that's having 1, 2, 3, close, no matter where, no matter what friends. A friend who sticks closer than a brother. And the friend might actually be a brother, could be a biological brother or sister. But the question is, who do you cling to? Who do you stick with? Who are you fiercely loyal to? Now is the time to just stop and ask yourself how you're giving of yourself to people in that way. And if you want a friend like that, then you got to be a friend like that. But you got to be careful about who you commit to in this way. Because the friends you commit yourself to, the person you choose to say no matter where, no matter what, the person you choose, be careful with that, because whoever you choose is going to determine so much of your future. And that's something that happens literally in the story of Ruth. And it always happens in our lives as well, where Ruth says to Naomi, where you go, I will go. And here's what we see in this, is that who you cling to determines where you go. And that was true for Ruth and Naomi, but that's just as true for you and me, that who you cling to, who you travel with, really determines where you end up. As much as anything else in life, who you cling to determines where you go. And everything about Ruth's life is going to be determined really by that one commitment that she makes to Naomi. And so Naomi and Ruth make it back to Bethlehem. They go back to the small towns, like 200 people that lived in this community. And when people see them coming, like, it had been a lot of years. A lot of years had passed, but clearly Naomi has not aged well. Like, she's been through a lot, right? But that's pointed out to us in the story. It says when they arrived to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" And then we read that Naomi says, "Don't call me that." She told them, "Call me Mara," because Mara, the word means bitter. And she says, "Call me Mara because the Almighty God has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Welcome home. Like, she seems like a blast to be around. Like, call me Mara because I'm bitter, and that's what the name means. It's hard to be around people like that.